Hello and welcome to the EPRS Chronicles. In this series, we will focus on corruption in the EU, how it is defined and measured, how much of it can be tackled at EU level, and what remains a national competence. For this, I'm joined by Piotr Bąkowski, an EPRS analyst who specialized in criminal law. Hello, Piotr.
Hello.
So let's start a bit with agreeing on what it is we're talking about today. How would you define corruption?
Well, there is no universal agreement as what corruption means. And even if you take the broad definition of corruption as abuse of power for private gain, even this relatively broad definition doesn't cover all corrupt practices. So we have a tendency to think of corruption as giving or taking bribes, active and passive bribery. But this narrow criminal law approach doesn't cover it all. So we can also think of corruption as a broader socioeconomic problem.
Well, can you give us a few more specific examples then?
Yes, well, nepotism, for example, when someone in a position of authority exploits their authority to grant favors to relatives or friends, as opposed to a merit-based system, or revolving door, where people tend to move from public jobs as regulators or lawmakers to industries which are affected by their decisions.
Given that we don't always know who is related to who or who worked for whom when, if it's a revolving door situation, how can we measure corruption more concretely?
Corruption is definitely not easy to measure because, we can rely on objective data only to a certain extent. First of all, corruption is a seriously underreported problem. We can only see the tip of the iceberg. So even if, in cases we do have data, like, for example, the number of corruption-related court cases, well, what do we learn from that? Does a high number of cases mean that there's a lot of corruption in a member state? Or does it mean that law enforcement is just active in investigating it? So because of these limitations, we tend to rely on indirect indicators. If you take, for example, the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, it is a tool based on perception. So we try to measure through opinion polls or assessments the opinion on the prevalence of corruption by individuals, experts, businesses.
Let's zoom into the situation in Europe, because the EU was founded on values such as the rule of law, democracy, transparency. So how do member states fare when it comes to corruption?
EU definitely does have challenges to face. And, even though some EU member states are indeed among the least corrupt countries in the world, there are no corruption-free zones in the EU. And there are certain phenomena which are worrisome, like, for example, in some member states, you've got these citizenship or residence for investment schemes which are corruption-prone. There have been high-profile corruption cases across the EU, including in the EU's own institutions. And there have even been cases of assassinations of journalists who investigated corruption or organized crime. So overall, there are issues to address.
And what is the perception of EU citizens when it comes to corruption in their own country?
Eurobarometers, EU's own public opinion polls, give us some ideas about it. So basically 70% of EU citizens think that corruption is widespread in their country. And 1/4 of respondents in those polls said that they were personally affected by corruption in their everyday life. But, of all these people, only a very small minority is actually willing to report corruption.
And why is that?
There are several reasons for that. First of all, individuals do not know which authority to turn to if they want to report corruption. They think it's very difficult to prove it. And even if we prove it, there's impunity. So perpetrators will simply not be punished for what they've done. And there is a feeling that the protection granted to whistleblowers, to those who report corruption, is not adequate.
Okay, well, that was very enlightening. Thank you, Piotr. Join us in episode 2, where we will talk a little more about what measures exist to combat corruption in the EU and what more can be done.